The following is a local resident producers program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Access Television, the City of Oshkosh, the Oshkosh Cable Television Advisory Commission, or Time Warner Cable.
Everyone, welcome to another edition of Eye on Oshkosh. Cheryl Hentz here along with Dan Rylance. Some 22 states have enacted some type of residency requirement or restriction that prohibits sex offenders from living within a certain distance from schools, daycare centers, or places where children congregate. An even greater number of communities across the country, including many right here in Wisconsin, have actually passed their own kind of local legislation that in some cases actually denies residency to sex offenders. Oshkosh is not one of them, though some minimal discussion has been held by our city council, kind of informally, I guess, but they've talked about it a little bit. Joining us on this edition is Nichole Hall. She is with the Wisconsin Department of Corrections, and we're going to be talking about residency restrictions, registration requirements, sex offenders in general, and we want to thank you and for being here, and we also want to thank the state for allowing you to appear tonight.
Right.
So
thank you for having me.
because you had to get their okay to do it. So I guess maybe the best place for us to begin, Nichole, is to define what a sex offender is under Wisconsin law.
That's a good place to start, because when people hear the word sex offender, often many things come to their mind. Predator is one of them, and I hear that used out of context quite a bit, that all sex offenders are predators, or that all sex offenders are pedophiles, is the other P word. And basically in Wisconsin, and I'll just start by talking in the context of our registry varies in who we have registered as a sex offender in the state. So we have all different ages, and and I say to people, what comes to your mind when you hear the word sex offender? And I give them a minute to think about it, and then I ask, did you think of an 8-year-old? Because our youngest offender registered when he was 8. Our oldest is somewhere in the neighborhood of 102, last that I heard. We are primarily male, but we do have females on the registry. We have all different ethnicities. We have rich people and poor people. We have offenders who have never held a job, offenders who have had the same, maybe a factory job for 20 years, and we have offenders that were formerly respected professionals in the community, like lawyers and priests and police officers and teachers. So I really stress to somebody that you can't just look at somebody and say, oh, well, he couldn't possibly be a sex offender. He's been a Boy Scout leader for 20 years and he loves kids, or she's a respected teacher in this community. It really can be anybody. Really, the common trait among sex offenders is that they thrive on secrecy. So now there's this whole registry that we have that really attempts to remove that secrecy and anonymity that sex offenders have historically thrived on.
Okay. As far as the legal definition goes, what classifies you as a sex offender? Do you, is it can include rape, which I know in Wisconsin we tend not to use the word rape in the legal setting. It's sexual assault, and there's varying degrees of that. But what does someone have to do in order to be prosecuted or convicted of sexual assault?
Well, like you mentioned, there are different degrees of sexual assault statutorily. Because I'm not an attorney, I'd probably feel more comfortable talking about what does someone have to do to become a registered sex offender in the state. Now, we have over 19,700 registered sex offenders in the state right now.
How many was that?
Over 19,700. The number as of today is 19,774.
Wow. It's amazing.
And we grow at a rate of about 120 each month. Now, in order to be a registered sex offender in Wisconsin, we have a list of 28 felony offenses, felony sexual assault crimes, that if you're convicted as an adult or adjudicated as a juvenile, registration is mandatory. There's no court order, there's no special hearing, it's automatic. In addition, we have offenses that are discretionary. An example might be criminal trespass to a dwelling. If it was a home invasion type crime that the court felt was the underlying conduct was sexually motivated, the court could order that person to register. Fourth degree sexual assault is a misdemeanor sexual assault that the court could order registration on. We also require offenders from other states that come to Wisconsin to live, work, or go to school here to register here. Or if they're convicted of an offense that would require registration in Wisconsin, they have to register here.
Okay.
We also require people that have convictions in military, tribal, or federal court to register. So we're actually the 7th largest registry in the nation. Now that's not because we have more sex offenders in Wisconsin. I think it's because we have such a strict requirement. We just are kind of all-encompassing and require more people to register than other states.
So tell me what an 8-year-old would do. Or what can an 8-year-old possibly do to be convicted and have to register as a sex offender? Because usually we think of kids that young as being the victims.
Right. I don't know what that 8-year-old did. I do know that many of the juvenile sex offenders I see, the offenses are within the family or within the home, maybe against a younger sibling. I have seen some pretty serious crimes committed by juveniles. And really that kind of brings me back to the point that the registry really is just such a broad spectrum. We do have pedophiles, and the definition of that really is someone who's primarily sexually attracted to young children and acts on that for a period of time. It's a clinical diagnosis. They are a very dangerous group, but they're also a pretty small group, fortunately. We have people on the registry that were 18 in an otherwise cooperative relationship with a 15-year-old, maybe boyfriend-girlfriend type thing, although there is a means for some of those people to come off of the registry by the court. And then, we have juveniles again where it was maybe similar in ages and no force, but then we do have some serious crimes as well. So the registry really has a wide range of people on it.
Is anyone exempt from registration?
The only people that can qualify for an exemption are the people that I mentioned, the otherwise age-prohibited teenage relationships, and that has to be by order of the court.
So that's it.
Long as we're unregistered.
Yes.
Could you hit also how many sex offenders are in Wisconsin prisons? How many are on supervision and off supervision? Because that would add significantly to the 19,000.
Right. And that is a very critical distinction. So of that 19,700, 5,758 are incarcerated.
Okay.
So they're in prison, but in addition, they're on the registry.
Okay.
Then we have 5,118 that are on active probation and parole supervision. I want to talk just a minute about that, if you don't mind.
Sure, go right ahead.
Go ahead.
Those people they've been convicted, they're either on probation or they went to prison and they came out and they're being supervised on parole or what we call extended supervision. So they have a wide range of rules and requirements that they follow. There are restrictions about where they live, where they work, if they can have contact with minors, sometimes including their own children, if they have to be in treatment, if they can drink, which most of them can't do a lot of these things, where they can be. There's just a lot of restrictions about what they can and can't do. They're seeing someone regularly. Many sex offenders are seen at least once a week and at least once a month within their home. Contact is made with their employers and their spouses or parents or significant others. So they are being supervised pretty closely, and then in addition they're on the registry. But the number that we focus on is this 8,898. So almost 9,000 of our registered sex offenders are off of probation and parole supervision. That means they've been convicted, sentenced, and served their time. Now they're otherwise free citizens like you and I, other than their requirement to register. Now there is a certain group of sex offenders, child sex offenders, who are subject to another law that prohibits them from working with kids. But other than that, this almost 9,000 group is free to live where they want, move as often as they want. And our job and what I do with the registry is to monitor that they are reporting the information that they're required to report to the registry.
Do you know offhand how many registered sex offenders, Nichole, we have here in Winnebago County alone?
I wasn't able to run the numbers for the
Okay.
county. I looked at some numbers from about 6 months ago, and it was over 300. I did run the numbers today for 3 of the Oshkosh zip codes, and there was 169 registrants
Okay.
In Oshkosh.
in the Oshkosh zip codes, 54901, 02, and 04. Now, I know when I gave that 19,000 number before, I saw a reaction, and I often see a reaction.
We should.
Right. But what I say to people is, really, that's the good news, believe it or not. That's the good news because we know about them. And I like to use the analogy of the tip of the iceberg. The 19,000 number is the part of the iceberg above the surface that we can see. Those are the ones we know about. Actually, what concerns me more than the registered sex offenders are the ones we don't know about, those that are below the surface. And that is a lot. There are a great deal of sex offenses that never get reported to the police. Upwards of 90% still don't ever come to the attention of the police. And then even when they do, they're very difficult to charge and prosecute and convict because there's so many different factors that go into each case.
We hear so much, Nichole, about sex offenders reoffending. And that they can't be treated. You know, I don't know if I don't work in that field at all. I don't know if that's true or not. But what is the recidivism rate for a sex offender?
Recidivism is kind of a difficult thing to put an exact number on. What I can tell you is it's much lower than what people think. When I came into corrections 13 years ago, I thought, well, if they did it once, of course they're going to do it again. You know, if they did it to their own child, of course they could do it to somebody else. And I've learned differently in my years with working with this population. One of the best studies, and what it did is it looked at a big group of studies that were done. So it looked at about 60,000 sex offenders. And what they came out with was about 13% reoffended sexually. It was a slightly higher number for rapists and actually slightly lower for child molesters.
Okay.
There have been other studies that have come out. Rarely are they higher than that. Actually, sometimes they're lower than that. Now, I do think you have to assume it's a somewhat higher number because of the ones that go unreported. But some of these studies did look at just a parole revocation for an allegation. It didn't necessarily have to be a new conviction. So that's an even broader spectrum. I think they captured more people that may have been reoffending. Plus, when somebody is a convicted sex offender, when there is a new crime, that tends to be the population that gets scrutinized a little more closely. So I think more of those crimes might come to light for this group than for the group not caught yet.
How do those numbers on recidivism compare to numbers for other types of crimes, whether it's drug-related crimes or murder or burglary, what have you?
Right. I know it's lower. I don't know those numbers off the top of my head, but I've heard repeatedly that sex offenders reoffend sexually at a lower rate than other offenders reoffend. And I didn't touch on your treatment issue. Before 1980, we didn't do a very good job with treating this group. But now we are seeing some significant gains, and we're seeing recidivism being reduced by up to 10%. With someone motivated, obviously they need to do their part, but for this population, if they want to benefit from treatment, there's definitely the tools out there to do that.
What kinds of treatment can be done?
Well, there are different kinds. We have treatments within the institution. Oshkosh Correctional has a very good, thorough, lengthy program for their population, and we have them throughout the different prisons. In the community, there are different treatment providers, and it's basically outpatient. What we used to do is talk a little bit more about, family background and what happened to you when you grew up, and it was kind of that group hug type thing. There's less of that. It's more cognitive based and behavioral based. So what were you thinking at the time of your offense? How did you make it okay in your head? Now let's dispel those justifications. What different things can you do? How can you behave in a different way? What kinds of settings should you avoid? So people develop relapse prevention plans, and we often bring family members into the mix so they're aware of what's going on and what the high-risk behaviors are.
Okay. Can
Just,
I just ask one question
yeah,
about
yeah,
the
go ahead,
registration
you bet.
real quick?
This will follow that.
This registry, people can access that on the internet, and we will be putting the address up throughout the show, as well as an address for victims. Those both will be going up. They're both website addresses. Is there anything in particular that people should know as they're accessing that registry? And the reason I ask that is because, as I'm sure you know, the circuit courts in the state have the CCAP program that you
Right.
can access people's, court activity, whether it's civil or criminal. And I think sometimes people misuse that because they don't know how to read the information that's there. They don't know how to interpret it. Is there anything on this registry that people should know in advance of going there?
Right. Well, if you go to our registry, first of all, there are several websites out there. The official Department of Corrections registry is widocOffenders.org. And other organizations take our information. They don't update it quite as frequently. I mean, I think it's valuable, but really ours is where the information comes from. What some people like about those other sites is they have a mapping function that you can plug in your area and you get an actual map with stars for visual people like me. That's kind of a nice thing. And that is coming soon to our website. That will be an enhancement that we have. So when you go to our website, you can search by name or by location. And by location, I mean you put in a zip code, and then you get everybody in the zip code, and then you click on each individual. You'll get a physical description, including a photograph, what they were convicted of, where they're living, and if they're compliant or not, and then a contact number if you have further questions. Now, often people will go to that and see somebody's convicted of second-degree sexual assault of a child and make the assumption that the child was very young, 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever, and that very well may be the case. But second-degree sexual assault of a child can also be the 17-year-old with the 15-year-old partner that was cooperative. So the statute doesn't necessarily indicate what the person was convicted of. So I just think it's important, as with anything, CCAP included, to do your homework. To look at that. If this is someone you know or you're having contact with, to not hesitate to call that number on there. If the person's on probation and parole, you'll actually get in touch with their agent. You can find out a great deal of information, including rules of supervision and restrictions. If they're not on supervision, you'll eventually make your way to me, and I can give some information and point you in a direction to get even more information. So, again, not to draw those conclusions that someone's a sex offender, so it must be this. It may be, but it may not be. So to have, we really believed an informed community is a safer community, and that people should take responsibility to be informed.
And if they are calling that number that's on the website, Nichole, do they need to have a need to know, or can it just be idle curiosity?
It's open records,
Okay.
and much of the information, even with probation and parole, is open records. Now, there's some information that can't be disclosed, like treatment or medical information or victim information, but in general, people can call and get that information.
Nichole, I live in an area where I regularly get notices at my mail or whatever. How long are they on this where they're identified in a community or a neighborhood?
Well, the statute defines how long somebody registers for.
Okay, how long?
So 5 of our, I mentioned there were 28,
28
mandatory offenses,
Okay.
right? 5 of those require lifetime registration. It's kind of the worst of the 5.
Okay.
That actually accounts for about 2/3 of our registry, lifetime registration. Most of the rest of the offenders register for their period of prison or probation or parole plus 15 additional years.
Okay. It's a long time. Are you familiar with Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter?
Yes, I have to jog my high school
Okay,
memory, but
You
yes.
know, Hester Prynne, who had the affair with
Right.
Reverend Timsdale, and she wouldn't
Right.
admit he wouldn't admit that he was the one, and so she had to wear the rest of
Right.
her life the A letter on her clothes. You know, I'm not going to make a case for them, but these people are really almost identified as Hester Prynne is for the rest of their life. Most people would say that equals their crime, but it is probably, of all of the crimes we have, it's the one that our society has said this is the most worst of all of them. But they are kind of branded, aren't they, with with a sexual predator, just like Hester was with the letter A.
Like I said, we're pretty cautious about using the sexual predator word.
Yeah.
So I don't think that a sex offender necessarily is a sexual predator.
But don't you think a lot of people, they are?
They may, they may make that connection. Now, there has been some trends in legislation that at times seem to be a little extreme. I think that the registry is a valuable tool. And maybe it helps to even look at why we have the registry. And we have the registry because of Jacob Wetterling. We wouldn't even have it if it wasn't for Jacob, or maybe we would, but really it's his case that kind of prompted all this.
And explain what that case is.
In 1989, Jacob was 11. He was living in rural Minnesota, riding his bike with two other little boys his age to the video store. On the way back, they were approached by a masked man with a gun who ordered all three boys to lay face down in the ditch. Ultimately, he took Jacob, and Jacob has never been seen since. Still, his parents have the Jacob Wetterling Foundation. They are still looking for him and hopeful to find him from 1989. It's pretty heart-wrenching. And really what they said was, okay, we have our sons abducted and there's not a lot of leads here. Okay, so wouldn't it help if we had a database of people who had been convicted of a sex offense so we could at least have something to go off of? And that is kind of the intent of where our legislation came in. There was a federal mandate, which is the Jacob Wetterling Act, which mandates all the states to adopt some version of a sex offender registry.
And if you didn't, you lose 10% of their...
We lose a significant amount of federal funding, right.
Yep.
But, I think, the intent of our legislation really is to have this balance between the community's protection, the community's right to know, and the offender's successful reintegration into the community. Now, often when I speak to communities, especially when I'm saying there's a sex offender moving into your neighborhood, I hear, I don't care about that sex offender's rights. Okay, they hurt kids. They're the worst of the worst, so I don't care about their rights. My child's rights are more important. There's kids in my neighborhood, there's parks in my neighborhood, there's schools in my neighborhood. So what I say to that is, first of all, I was a probation and parole agent for a lot of years supervising high-risk sex offenders, and I was never defined as being light on sex offenders. If you ask anyone I supervised, they wouldn't tell you that. And probably not now either. But I define successful reintegration into the community, part of that balancing act, as no more victims. Okay? And so I think no matter who I'm talking to, at least we share that goal. We don't want there to be any more victims. And so if an offender is coming out of prison because they've served their time under however they were sentenced, which most of them do, it's rare to see a sex offender coming out early for good behavior anymore. So they've served their time, they're coming out. Now, if no one will rent to them and no one will hire them and people are harassing them or there's acts of vigilantism, I think that puts them in a risky situation because most sex offenses are more about power and control than they are about the sex. It's not true for all of our offenders. The pedophiles, it is more sexual. That's what makes them more dangerous. But most of them, it's just power and control. So if they're in that situation where they're having a tough time finding all these things that they need to succeed, that we all need to succeed, then I think they're at a higher risk to reoffend. So I think, long answer to your question, but I think that it's important to have the information. It's important to know about convicted sex offenders. Many of them do pretty bad things. But to use that information responsibly and to really keep in mind the whole tip of the iceberg theory. These are the ones we know about. We've automatically taken away some of their power just by the knowledge of who they are. But to really be aware that they could be anywhere. If you're in a neighborhood and you get that notice that the sex offender moves in, if you were to learn that the sex offender moved out, should you do anything different? No. Really, you should practice protective behaviors and family safety every single day, whether you've gotten one of those notices or you know of someone or not.
And the fact of the matter is, even if you don't get a notice in the mail, chances are you've got some kind of a sex offender living in your neighborhood anyway, don't you?
I don't run the registry for my neighborhood. That surprises people. I don't. If I ran the registry and I found that there was a registrant in my neighborhood, I probably wouldn't do anything different than I do today to keep myself safe. If I ran it and there wasn't one in my neighborhood, I wouldn't do anything different than I do to keep myself safe.
I think that's a really good point.
Right. Now, I do have to clarify that a little. If I knew there was a registered sex offender living across the street from me and I saw teenage girls or boys regularly visiting, I might make that call sooner to the police department than I would otherwise. But really, as far as my day-to-day safety, it wouldn't really change.
Well, we've got a lot of things to cover, but you just touched on things to keep ourselves safe. What would be some of those things? I mean, what would you suggest to people?
I do think it's important, first of all, when you're looking at safety, is to, only if you understand the problem can you take productive steps to be safe from it. Mm-hmm. So if people spend all their time looking in the bushes for the stranger, they're going to miss it. 93% of sex offenders know their victims.
Wow.
They take time to get to know the victim, to gain the victim's trust. We call this grooming. Sometimes it is as blatant as here's some candy. Other times it's, hey, I know you're having a hard time with your kids, you're a single mom, let me take them overnight. I'll give you a break. And they do, they groom the child and the family. Or even the 20, 21-year-old looking at the 14, 15-year-old kind of vulnerable, high-risk child. So I think that's an important thing to know. For a long time, we used to do stranger danger. And so I think I've just poked a big hole in stranger danger when 93% of offenders know their victims.
Of the 93%, what percent are family members?
I don't know, but
It would be high, wouldn't it?
I would say it's higher. I know about 60% of crimes happen either in the home of the victim or the offender. So I mean, this isn't an out on the street abduction type thing, which understandably is every parent's worst nightmare. I totally get that. And I don't think you should ignore it, but that was just everybody's focus for so long. So really, when talking with children about how to keep themselves safe, there's a program that I really embrace and the department embraces called Protective Behaviors. And basically, it gives kids tools to keep themselves safe in a variety of settings, not just against sex offenders, but against bullying and racism and all different kinds of problems that they might find. Some of the themes are you have the right to feel safe all the time, and other people have the right to feel safe with you. And you can talk with someone you trust about anything, no matter how awful or how small. Just those kind of themes that you can talk with kids day to day, every day. And then it goes through these 5 steps about helping them learn, to identify when they feel safe and unsafe. Their body will give them clues as to when they're in an unsafe situation. Their heart will race, or they'll get sweaty, or they'll start to breathe faster, or they feel like they can't talk, or helping them identify what that is. Having them come up with a network of people, at least 5 people they trust with anything, no matter how awful or how small, and then teaching them to be persistent, to keep telling. There's a statistic out there that kids try to tell 7 times before they're believed and the abuse stops. That's just horrific to me. So to teach kids to keep telling until they feel safe.
Okay.
But really what it's about is the communication. Having that open dialogue with your kids about how they're feeling and what kind of situations that they're in. And then I think you throw some of those other scenarios in there. There was recently a case that I heard within this past week of a 5-year-old that was abducted from her home and managed to escape from the offender's car. Now again, the odds of that happening are so small, but very, very scary. So, but if you feel like you need to talk about some of that with your kids, say, okay, what could somebody do even if they were in this situation? And have them brainstorm and think, what could somebody do even if they came home from school and they were locked out and nobody was home? What could somebody do even if their friend was being bullied at school? Even if someone touched them in a way that made them feel unsafe? So just kind of general safety and having that open discussion with kids.
What about just for adults? Say their kids have long since moved on or they don't have children. I think sometimes adults, especially women, tend to be a little bit concerned if they know that a sexual offender is moving into their neighborhood. Is there anything special that they can do?
There is, and a lot of it is common sense, but it doesn't hurt to have those reminders. One thing we use with the kids that I encourage adults to use is the first rule of safety. For kids, it's always tell an adult where you're going, who you will be with, and when you will return, the 3 W's. I think it's absolutely appropriate that parents do that with their kids, so kids know where they are, and adults do that amongst themselves. If you live alone, it doesn't hurt to leave a note. Went rollerblading, be back at 7.
See, I try and do that, and I'm told that I'm overreacting, and
really, it doesn't hurt. Again, I mean, what are the odds of that happening? I don't know, but what harm does it do to take those extra precautions?
Sure.
Some other general safety tips are when you're out in public at the mall or the grocery store, to park in a well-lit area, limit the number of items that you carry. Within your home, have motion-sensitive lighting at your house. Keep your bushes and your trees well trimmed so no one can hide there. Shut your curtains at night. There are a lot of window peekers out there, and I don't know statistically how many of them escalate to hands-on offenses, but I have seen it in the reverse, where some home invasion people started out window peeking. So that's a simple thing to do.
Sure.
If you're a single female, have an unlisted number, or just list your first initial and last name and not your address. You can do that. You can list your name and not your address. Lock your doors. That's such a simple thing that people overlook. And you know, you often hear, is this fair that we have to live in this society? Is it fair that I don't feel safe taking a walk at 10:30 on a nice night like tonight? No, it's not. But that really is the reality, and so it really just makes sense to take those safety precautions.
Wisconsin has a lot of people in prison. Our budget for corrections now is more than higher education. You know, it's kind of, you got to kind of think about that, what kind of society that we have to spend that much.
Right.
Also, I would think a young person in college might want criminal justice as a major more than to be a public school teacher, because the budget for corrections is now more than it is. Any thoughts about going into criminal justice, your career, different areas that a young college student might want to look at? What are the ups and downs of a career in what you're doing?
Okay.
And the opportunities.
Right. I love what I do. It's very interesting. No day is ever the same. I am never looking at the clock thinking, oh, I got 2 more hours yet. I'm always thinking, oh, I only have 2 hours left. I have so much to do. For me, it's been very rewarding. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities out there for it. And really, there's so many opportunities, even within the Department of Corrections, to switch between, you know, the field, meaning probation and parole, or the registry, like what I do, or within the institution, there's social workers and different management positions. And really, there's really no excuse not to find something you enjoy doing if you're inclined to be in this profession anyway. It's just, for me, it's very interesting and rewarding.
Sure.
Do you have a degree in criminal justice? Is that
I do.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mentioned in the open, Nichole, that some 22 states, and I don't know that that's the exact number, but it's right around 22 states have enacted residency requirements and restrictions and that kind of thing. And then on top of that, you've got hundreds and probably thousands of municipalities across the country that have sort of enacted their own restrictions, and in some cases actual denials of registered sex offenders living in their communities. Oshkosh is not one of them, but Green Bay, I believe, has done that. We've heard of other smaller communities around here, even townships, that have been or are going to be looking at it. You know, there are problems with doing something like that. I think we can probably all appreciate the spirit of that kind of legislation. But there's a lot of problems that are associated with it, and they could be causing us, in the long run, more harm than good. Right. Can you maybe, you know, illustrate for us what some of those problems are?
I can. I think you hit it right on the head. The intentions are very noble to protect children, right? And so it makes a lot of sense on the surface to a lot of people. Now, officially, the Department of Corrections doesn't have a position on this, but we are knowledgeable of other areas that have done that and some of the unintended negative consequences that they've experienced, and there are many. I think a lot of the reaction is based on what people have seen in other areas. Iowa has a statewide restriction. It's pretty large. I think it's 2,000 feet. And what Iowa found was very soon after they implemented it, their noncompliance with the sex offender registry doubled. In fact, I saw something the other day that said tripled. So I'm not sure which it is, but it went up dramatically. And so what you're finding is some groups that might surprise you are opposed to these restrictions. Now in Iowa, the Iowa County Attorneys Association, which is a group of prosecutors, not defense attorneys, they're opposed to it. The National Association to End Sexual Violence, so a victim advocacy group, is opposed to it. The Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault is opposed to it. The National Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers is opposed to it. the Jacob Wetterling Foundation. I've seen statements from the Jacob Wetterling Foundation, the reason we even have this registration, that they think it's a bad idea. So why is that? What are all their reasons? So they really overlap. First of all, the restrictions are based on that whole stranger danger myth. They're based on, we don't want a sex offender living across the street from our schools, so they won't abduct a child. Well, we've learned that 93% of offenders know their victims, right? So that is a huge problem that these groups see with it. As a result, it gives people a false sense of security. The town of Algoma, attached to Oshkosh, actually has the residency restriction, and someone in the town who knows me, a respectable, intelligent woman, said to me, "Oh, I'm so glad we have that restriction, because I don't know what I would do if there was a sex offender in my neighborhood." So really,
She's probably got one living there and she doesn't even know it.
it really just underscores the whole point that sex offenders are still there. Now, there's no evidence it works. Statistically, I think if it was proven that where someone lives is connected to if they abduct a child from a school, if we could prove that, I think that the state and the department would back this wholeheartedly. But there is no evidence that shows that. And in fact, the evidence that's out there shows that offenders who choose stranger victims drive a significant distance to get those victims. There's also no evidence that it works because offenders stay where they live. They live where they live because we live where we live. They have family support, they have purchased a house, they can afford it, it's close to their employment. So they may want to comply with the law, but they may find themselves in such a lose-lose situation that they just stay where they're at. Then we have the problem that we don't know where they are, which gets back to the whole spirit of the Jacob Wetterling Act of at least knowledge is power. Knowing where they are is half of the battle. In addition, it increases other factors that are linked with reoffense. With all offenders, including sex offenders, stability in family, residence, and employment are linked with success, meaning not reoffending. So these laws tend to take away those things, stability in where they're living, working, and their family support. Oftentimes it re-victimizes the victim. Getting back to that whole most offenders know their victims. So, you know, sometimes children report abuse of a parent. The parent is abusing them. And they want to be with the parent, they just want the abuse to stop. So often there's separation, there's confinement, there's supervision, probation or parole, there's treatment, the child's involved in treatment, there's a safety plan in place, and they're reunited. And that is what the child wants. Now, to say you can never, ever, ever be reunited because he can't come home is traumatic to victims and sometimes decreases reporting. We also have very physically debilitated offenders who are in nursing homes, or cognitively or developmentally disabled offenders who need that support. Some of the police departments and sheriff's departments across the country have come out against it, because if the people move like they're supposed to, then it pushes all the sex offenders out to the rural areas where there's less enforcement and monitoring. So those are the reasons that those groups oppose those laws and the problems that other areas have experienced with them.
Regardless of that, and I agree with you 100% on that, you know, if a local council member goes to his city government and introduces a resolution like this, you people have almost got to vote for it, because the stigma of that is so, the pressure at the local level not to do something, even if it's based on false studies that you've indicated, it makes it hard for elected people at the local level not to vote for it. And that's what's happening, that these are being brought to common councils all over. And it's sort of like the anti-smoking thing. In time, there's going to be so many different local ordinances that at some point the state may, like Iowa, may say, here is the state ordinance that's going to deal with it, because we have all sort of different local ones. But I think politically it'd be very hard at the local level if you're an elected common council member. If you bring in an ordinance 2,000 feet, whatever it is, you know, it makes it very difficult for the rest of the council members to vote no on it. It's a very explosive issue.
Well,
Yes.
if they use their common sense.
Well, I'm not going to go into that.
Well,
But I mean, it is such an explosive issue.
sure.
Yeah.
But then there's the whole constitutionality of the thing too. You know, are you punishing someone for, or repunishing someone for a crime they've already committed. I've even heard of some cases where people have literally been forced out of homes that they own because of laws like this.
I hear you.
And, what do you know, Ms. Nichole, about, the constitutionality of this? It's been challenged, I know, in some places, and some places it's been upheld, and other places it's been deemed, unconstitutional.
Well, I know there's been some challenges. I don't know of any successful challenges to date. That doesn't mean that there aren't any. But I think kind of what you're getting at, it is a very emotionally charged issue. And again, for someone who's been victimized, to say, well, you shouldn't worry about that is a difficult thing. But I do think that, for me, it speaks volumes when groups like the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault, national victim advocacy groups, the Jacob Wetterling Foundation, when those people, I think if there was evidence that it worked, they would take different positions on it. But there really just isn't any, and so I think that's why they keep coming back to this is not the solution to the problem. And, sex offenders are a problem. Sexual assault is a problem. We definitely need to always fight the fight to end it. I think these groups are just saying this isn't the solution.
Why is it that the Department of Corrections won't take a position on it?
It is a very difficult issue. So really that's a legislative issue, and we're not in a position to advocate for legislation one way or another. Our job is to kind of enforce what's out there.
You're one of the few groups that won't take a position politically on stuff.
They're wise.
That's right, that's right.
It may get to you, though, as I said, because there's going to be so many of these irregular and different ones.
Well, and the legislature has looked at it before. I think they continue to look at it. There's some talk out there about different kind of similar solutions, like maybe child safety zones. What's happening sometimes is there's these restrictions in a local area, and the offender can't live across the street from a park, but the offender can be in the park all day long.
Sure. And drive by a school, sit outside a playground.
Right.
Doesn't do
so
anything
I think
about
they're
those
looking
things.
at other solutions that make more sense to them. And so I think our legislature is hearing testimony about those issues and what works and what doesn't and what the research shows.
Yeah, they need to pass a budget.
They got to do that first.
Yeah, I think, that's number one for corrections as well as for every other.
As long as I can keep getting paid, I'm happy.
Talk about the internet a little bit. She knows a lot more about the internet than I do.
Not
but
really.
I read a figure from the former Attorney General of the United States, Alberto Gonzales, that there were 50,000 sex offenders on computers every hour. Is this an increasing amount of people that are getting caught is because they're using the internet to, is that increased?
Well, I'm kind of a statistics person.
Okay,
I like to
this-
see it, and kind of digest it and then say, okay, this is how it is. I haven't seen a lot of statistics like that. I think because it's a very quickly evolving animal of its own, So the one study I am aware of was done by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children back in 2000. And of course, things have changed light years since 2000 already, even in the world of computers. But what they found is that, obviously millions and millions and millions of people are online every day. It's this great resource. I don't know how I would get anywhere without it anymore, without going to, MapQuest or Google or whatever, or find a recipe or whatever it might be.
That's right.
So there's a lot of really good things out there, but the thing to keep in mind is that there's no censors. Anybody can be anybody, and there's no way to check it. Logically, it seems that this is just a place that sex offenders would gravitate to if they're motivated to reoffend. So, before, if an offender did truly want to assault a child, they'd have to physically go out and, meet a family and make those connections and groom the child, or, go to the park or wherever they were going to go. But now, in their own living room, in the privacy of their home, they can log on and be whoever, be a 15-year-old child. So I do think it's an area of concern. I think it's a whole new set of problems that parents face that, you know, my parents didn't have to deal with. I was just on the phone all night long. You know, now kids are on the internet all night long.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy for parents to say, well, I can't do anything about this. My child set up my parental controls on my computer.
Right.
So how am I supposed to monitor what
Boy,
they do?
that's well said,
Right.
isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
So it's easy to do that, but we encourage people not to do that, because what the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children found is that a significant amount of kids were experiencing unwanted exposure to pictures of naked people, to pictures of sex acts, to pornography. Some were receiving aggressive sexual solicitations. So there's definitely this stuff happening out there, and you can't just give up. Some very easy, kind of common sense things to do as a parent are, first of all, get rid of the computer in the basement, in the office basement, or in the child's bedroom. The computer should be in a common area of the home. Monitor what your child does, and that helps to monitor that. You know, look over their shoulder, see what they're doing. Have them show you what they're doing. They might accidentally teach you something that could come in handy for you later. Use those filtering and blocking devices. They won't prevent everything, but they will help. Limit the amount of time your child spends on the computer. For children who were ultimately assaulted via someone they met online, in hindsight, parents said, well, the warning sign was she was on the computer until 1, 2, 3 in the morning. Or I'd go in his bedroom and he'd be in there on the computer. I didn't know he was doing it, but he was. So if your rule is an hour and a half a day, stick to an hour and a half a day. You know, those are just some real simple things. And this whole MySpace, Facebook, all these social networking sites that kids are on, I think pose a significant challenge to parents, because it really is the way kids are socializing. But to really just always talk to your kids about safety. Do not give out your personal information. Set your profile to private. Do not put provocative photos of yourself in a low-cut dress or your swimming suit online. Once they're out there, you can never get them back.
Yeah.
You don't know who has them, how they've distorted them, what they're doing when they're looking at them. You just don't, there's no way to get it back ever.
What they're going to use them for at some
Right.
point down the road.
A lot of these kids say, oh, hey, are you going to the West basketball game tonight? Yeah, I am, and I'm going to go to Hardee's first. Well, if I am a sex offender with some deviant intentions, I now know your first and probably last name, where you go to school, that you'll be at the basketball game, and that you might be at Hardee's before or after the game. And I may have your picture, so I know exactly what you look like. If offenders can figure out first and last names, and then maybe the person might refer to their mom by a first name. Now they've got the parent's first and last name. They can go to whitepages.com, get a phone number, possibly an address, go to MapQuest, get right to the front door. So I'm not saying this is happening every hour of every day. I don't know the numbers, but it is happening. It could happen. And so really to teach your kids about protecting their privacy. Also just common sense. Colleges are now looking at these profiles before admitting people. Employers. So what you put out there could haunt you for a very long time.
Can you explain the Deleting Online Predators Act?
I can't.
Okay. It wasn't meant to be a trick question.
That's okay.
It's a federal law which requires schools and libraries to protect minors from commercial and social networking websites. So there's supposedly, if you're going to use a computer in the school or in a public library, that they, by this law, are required to set up some restrictions that protect them.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a recent law, and
Okay.
it's a federal law. But that would at least school and library would help. It's not going to help with the home.
Right.
But they're
Well, and the National Center for Missing, taking that kind of to the next level, schools teaching kids about online safety. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Kids has a program called Net Smarts.
Okay.
And it's a wonderful program. You can go online to their website, and I say to parents, if you aren't computer savvy, find a 12-year-old to help you. Again, going back to the whole problem for parents. But really go there, because there's a safety program, an internet safety program for parents to use with kids, an internet safety program for teachers, for teachers and parents. So, and you can sit down with your kids and do it. It's very entertaining. The kids like it. That's part of what we do sometimes, is go into the schools and give that information. So, and we're starting young. I mean, there's a program for kindergarten and first graders on there.
Well, there's first graders out there who probably know more about computers
Yes.
than most of us sitting at this table. So
Yes,
that's the
absolutely.
frightening
Yeah,
part of that.
absolutely.
Right.
I want to go back for a moment to the registry.
Yes.
Because you had mentioned that there is a way for some of these people, like the 17-year-old or the 18-year-old who's had consensual sex with maybe a 15 or 16-year-old girlfriend, for them to come off the registry.
Right.
Is that something that's available for anyone in a situation like that, or does it depend on each specific case?
Right. First of all, I want to be cautious not to overly minimize those situations. Oftentimes what we see are these 17, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, really taking advantage of 14-year-olds, 15, really looking at troubled people or people who have been victimized before. So, but there are definitely those otherwise, senior freshman kind of relationships that there really is no force and the parents aren't overly disturbed by it. And so in those cases, yeah, I mean, it's a statute. It's part of the statute. So if certain criteria are met, the offender has to be under 19, the victim has to be, I believe, I forget now, 12 or older, or 14 or older, I think. There had to be no force or no threat of force. All these criteria need to be in place, and then the court can remove that person. Okay. You mentioned the 16-year-old. Actually, that would be a misdemeanor and wouldn't require registration.
Okay. All right.
So for all these people, the victim was 15 or younger.
Okay. All right.
So
and those are cases too where these residency restriction things, I think, are dangerous, because you're basically then saying this person cannot. You take the 8-year-old, for example. My God, I don't know what this child did, but they're a registered sex offender and they're 8 years old, and to have them be banished basically from an entire community in some cases, that's pretty young to be banished from a kingdom.
And I don't know if the restrictions apply to juvenile offenders, because in Wisconsin right now, juvenile offenders are not part of the general public website. Only adults are.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
They may or they may not, but yes. And one thing we talked about before was notification, about
yes.
getting the notice on your door. If you don't mind if I
Go
just
ahead.
touch on
No,
something
go
with
right
that.
ahead.
Okay.
Sure.
A lot of times people will call and say, look, I found out there's a registered sex offender down the street from me. Why wasn't I notified? There is a misconception that people will get a knock on their door for every sex offender in their neighborhood, or at least there used to be. I think people are learning that that's not the case. Again, really the intent of our law was not to notify on every registered sex offender. Really it was to highlight the most serious ones. And I think in part because, and I did experience this with one community that I covered, where they put everybody in the paper, regardless, every adult offender in the paper regardless. And I never got a call from that community. And I think that people partially stopped paying attention because there was really no way to distinguish, the 19-year-old with the 15-year-old and the true pedophile. That's very dangerous. So, and then also I think it could work in the reverse where, okay, so these are the 20 offenders in my community. I know every one of them. Well, then they forget about the rest of the iceberg, the rest of these offenders that may not be on the registry. So really the intent was to highlight the ones that are most concerning. So what we do is we work in conjunction with the police department and the sheriff's departments, because the law puts us in charge of registration and law enforcement in charge of notification. So on certain offenders coming out of prison who have had 2 or more convictions for a sexual offense, those are the people that kind of trigger us to formally review the case. Is this something we need to notify the community about? Not that we couldn't notify on anybody else, but for those people, it's just kind of a heads up. We should talk about this. The Oshkosh Police Department is very proactive with their notifications. If they're ever in doubt, they do the full-blown meeting, press release. They've done some really creative things, including OCATs and using the cable access shows. So, but you do have access all the time through the website. And again, always be safe and practice protective behaviors.
About how many? How wide of an area do you cover?
I actually work part-time. I job share, so I cover 4 counties.
Okay.
So I think that's about 1,000 registrants primarily that I'm responsible for that are off supervision, and then I also assist with those that are on supervision as well.
Wow. That's a tremendously big caseload, I would think.
What are the 4 counties?
Winnebago, Sheboygan, Fond du Lac, and Dodge.
Okay. And about how many notification meetings, the full-blown meetings that you were just talking about, do you do, say, in a year's time?
Yeah, it really varies, but I would say between 6 and 12 a year. I mean, normally not more than that. It depends, though. It depends on the releases and who's getting released.
Sure. And just real briefly, Nichole, what kinds of things are discussed at these meetings?
A lot of what we talked about tonight.
Okay. All right.
I'd say 75% of the meeting is education, because we really feel a need to get the message out to the community. Really to have that balance of safety, but accepting that this is a community problem, and there really isn't an easy out for it, and we all just really need to be informed about the issue. And then maybe 25% is about that offender and their history, and if they're on supervision, what their restrictions are. They may not be on supervision. And then we do a written question and answer period.
I would think that, when people get a notification of a meeting, they would probably be angry and upset, frustrated, scared.
Right.
What has your experience, I mean, you've been doing this a long time, what has your experience been about how they feel after that meeting?
That's very interesting. When the press covers the meeting, often the interviews you see on TV are before the meeting, when people are having all those really understandable feelings. Most of the time after the meeting, people walk away much more understanding of the problem, of what the solutions might be, and accepting of it. Often they find the person's crime wasn't as bad as they thought it might be, but they feel at least relieved that they know about the person and these other people and about the tools they have available to them. There are some people who leave just as unhappy as they came, and that's okay. All we can do is give them the information and hope that they use it responsibly.
Okay, good. Any closing, parting thoughts for us and for viewers on things to keep themselves safe? We've been putting up the address for the website throughout the show. I know, just tell us real quickly what this Victim's Voice website is.
Well, so we have our website, but
Yes.
then if you've been victimized by a sex offender, you can register or enroll with us, and then you can have access to the person that offended against you, to their information a little bit differently than the rest of the public. So, for example, when you go to that person's information, a picture doesn't pop up. You can click on it if you want to see it, but you don't have to see it. You get notices of all parole hearings and forbidden escape, and not that that happens, but if it were, you'd find out about it, of all releases, of exact address of where they're living. Of course, that's on the general public website now. That wasn't always the case. So it just gives them, again, more of a voice. If there's a parole hearing coming up, they have an opportunity to speak out. If there's a release coming up, they know about it before they read it in the paper. If they've kept their... Problem is, many times their information isn't current, so we have a hard time locating them, but we do make efforts to do that before a release.
Sure. Well, and again, as you said before, knowledge is power.
Right.
Knowledge is strength.
Right.
And the most information that you can get
You bet.
is the better. So, anyway, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks
We
for
having me.
appreciate it. The
Thank
year,
you.
the hour went fast here, but we'll have you back again if situations change or
Great.
whatever. So, and again, thanks to the department as well.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
Dan, thank you. Thanks to the crew, and as always, thanks to all of you at home. We'll see you next time. Until then, take good care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.